Hello friends and welcome back to the channel. You probably expected a fish room tour, but this isn't an ordinary one. These are my 4 favorite aquatic projects of 2025, showing how they've changed, struggled and evolved throughout the year. Expect aquascaping, predator-prey interactions, real drama and ecosystems full of fish, crustaceans, insects, snails and plants. Let's jump right in. Our fish room tour starts with a tropical river flowing through this glass box. Plants as tall as a grown-up man, fish moving through layers, predators and grazers locked into balance. But this did not happen overnight. This is the result of 420 days of growth, mistakes and nature pushing back. Every river begins at the bottom. Pond soil. On top, I used old substrate from a tank that was running for around 15 years straight, which is already packed with living bacteria. And on top of that, simple play sand. Nothing fancy. No bottle shortcuts, no chemical fixes, just biology and time. Within days, life moves in. Snails grazing the glass, corridoras sifting the sand, and guppy fish claiming the surface. The system wakes up fast. By week 2, the jungle takes over. Plants explode with growth, without CO2, without chemical fertilizers. But growth always has a shadow. An algae bloom follows, thick strands of algae creeping across glass and leaves. This is the first lesson. Abundance always demands regulation. So, the ecosystem expands. Amano shrimp and cherry shrimp arrive, tireless cleaners, working day and night. Amber tetras fill the empty midwater on day 150, glowing orange against the green, turning empty space into movement. For a while, everything fits. On day 165, the rules change completely. Predators enter the system. Mr. Krabs, confident and fast. And Larry Lobster, injured, barely holding on life. Missing almost everything except the will to live. In a healthy ecosystem, weakness isn't erased, it's tested. 11 days later, Larry has regrown every missing leg. Not because the system is kind, but because it is actually a functional ecosystem and provides enough hiding space in plants for animals to recover. I introduced dwarf crayfish for one key role: to control the guppy population. They should in theory eat the young disabled fish that sometimes hatch after inbreeding occurred and thus lead to a natural population control. But predators don't choose favorites. When Mr. Krabs strikes, it's sudden, it's brutal and real. For a moment, the line between observation and intervention disappears. This is the hardest part of ecosystem keeping, knowing when to let nature act and when responsibility steps in. I saved a guppy Goopert, from a horrible death. He survived his predator, and even parts of his tail grew back some weeks later. But was Guppy Goopert ready for the next threat to this ecosystem? The next threat was not an animal. It was not a threat within the ecosystem itself. It was heat. During the summer heatwave in Germany, oxygen dropped, metabolisms accelerated, and even strong animals failed. This wasn't imbalance from within. It was pressure from the outside world. In just a few weeks, the system lost its largest animals. Both Mexican dwarf crayfish and my beloved corridoras catfish, as well as the black molly. And recovery doesn't look gentle. So on day 295, 3 black coolie loaches arrived, silent, eel-like hunters. And in a single flash, a guppy fry disappears. No drama. No hesitation, just regulation. After that, the snails exploded in numbers and were hunted. Algae spread and is grazed. Assassin snails, autosynclus catfish, each problem creates its own solution. After 420 days, this tank isn't perfect. It will never be, but it's alive. Balance here isn't a destination, it's a constant negotiation between growth, loss and adaptation. A tropical river inside a glass, reminding us that nature never stops adjusting. The next stop in our fish room tour today is the Danube River jar paludarium, a tiny world consisting of a land and water section. But before we get to this ecosystem, we need to go back to the largest river in the European Union. On a quiet Saturday morning, the city is only just waking up. From a bridge over the Danube, the first thing you notice is noise. A tractor passing by, heavy and loud. But once it fades, the river takes over. Wide, calm, almost effortless. Birds calling in the distance. Ducks and geese drifting across the surface. Standing here, you feel the scale of it. Not just as a river, but as a system that stretches nearly 2,900 kilometers, which is 1,700 miles, across Europe. And somewhere, inside all of that water, countless smaller worlds are hidden. Just a short drive away, one of the Danube's side lakes tells a different story. The lawn nearby is clearly shaped by people, but beyond it, nature quietly reclaims control. Rain from earlier that morning still hangs in the air. Everything is damp and alive. At the shoreline, a frog sits motionless, so perfectly camouflaged among algae and plants that it almost disappears. It's a reminder that life doesn't retreat when humans arrive. It adapts, hides, and continues. Below the surface, the lake reveals itself fully. Plants sway gently, algae coats submerged branches. Tiny organisms move invisibly through the water, already building and maintaining an intact ecosystem. From here, only a small fragment is taken. A bit of moss, a few plants, and some rocks. And a scoop of water mixed with dirt. It doesn't look impressive, but it's full of microfauna, the invisible pioneers that make everything else possible. The forest nearby provides the rest. A fallen stick will one day break down into food. Dead leaves layered with fungi and microbes. A bright green patch of moss, a pioneer plant, holding moisture and sheltering tiny life. Only a small piece is taken, leaving the rest untouched. Everything connected already belongs to a larger cycle. Back home, the jar waits empty and clean. This jar was once a wedding gift for my wife Selina and me from my friends Chris and Charlotte, and now is a glass boundary for a living system. Stones from the lake form a natural barrier between land and water. A branch adds structure and scale. Soil fills the gaps, anchoring plants and feeding roots. Moss is laid down like a soft forest floor, still damp from the woods. Sand settles into a pale shoreline. Slowly, the jar stops feeling like an object and starts feeling like a place. When the lake water is finally added, the jar clouds over. For a moment, nothing is visible anymore. But by the next morning, the water cleared, and the hidden world appears. Tiny specks dart through the water column, copepods, among the most abundant animals on Earth. Barely visible, yet essential. Grazing on algae and bacteria, turning invisible matter into life and becoming food for something else. Without them, this system wouldn't last long. At night, the jar changes again. With the light on, movement fills every corner. Among the copepods, something else appears. A planarian worm, flat, slow, and unsettling. A predator and scavenger capable of regrowing its entire body if cut apart. Almost immortal in its own way. Sharing the same space is a mayfly nymph, one of the most ancient insects on Earth. It may live underwater for months or years, quietly grazing and cleaning, only to emerge as an adult for a single fleeting day. Two extremes of survival, side by side in the same glass world. About a week later, the ecosystem shifts once more. The water level is lowered to expand the land section and the glass is cleaned. And new inhabitants arrive. Rubber ducky isopods, brightly patterned, slow-moving and highly sensitive to their surroundings. They step carefully through moss and over bark, sensing moisture, vibrations and chemical traces. They don't rush, they explore, grazing on biofilm, decomposing leaves and microorganisms. They take on the quiet role of recyclers, turning decay into continuity. The contrast is striking. Large isopods moving deliberately above water, while almost microscopic copepods are flashing below. Predators, grazers, decomposers. All present, all connected, inside a single jar. This is what the Danube looks like when you shrink it down. Not a river, but a network of interactions. Not a scenery, but process. A reminder that even the smallest container can hold an entire world, if you give it time, patience, and the chance to unfold on its own. Before we head to our next story, let's have a brief look at 3 other projects within the fish room that didn't make it into the final stories of the year. The first one is the Scud Jar, which is an aquatic world that has been closed for more than a year now. Let me know in the comments if you want an update on that ecosystem. Then we have another closed jar ecosystem that holds springtails, ginger plants, moss and Hygrophila corymbosa plants, which are aquatic plants that grow for a year now without water. Also, going one level lower, we have the Neocaridina shrimp colony, a breeding tank that holds multiple generations of Neocaridina davidi shrimp. Lovely, tiny grazers that keep reproducing almost every week. And then we move to our next short story, the tank that almost failed. 86 days ago, this tank didn't exist. It was just an empty glass box and a risky idea, to recreate a small piece of the Amazon River inside my fish room. What followed wasn't a smooth build. It was algae, loss, a mystery baby fish, and a decision that could have destroyed everything. I wanted the scape to feel ancient, like it had existed long before I touched it. Heavy stones formed the river's backbone. A single forest branch became the anchor point. I got this branch from a trip to the Neckar River. And just added it to the tank straight, no chemical treatment or cleaning required. And underneath it all, expanding foam locked the structure together. Almost invisible, but essential. Within days, life took hold. Plants rooted, water cleared, the tank woke up. It looked stable, almost too perfect. Then came the fish. Adolphus corridoras catfish on the sand, platyfish near the surface, and Apistogramma dwarf cichlids claiming their territory. Last but not least, a tight school of glow-light tetras lighting up the center. Two days later, I spotted something I hadn't planned for. A tiny baby fish. No one knew where it came from. Was it platyfry or cichlid offspring? In a tank with predators, its survival felt unlikely. But the real danger hadn't even started yet. Several days later, the tank turned. Algae crept across the hardscape. Then exploded. Filamentous algae wrapped itself around the centerpiece, smothering the plants I was most proud of. And then I saw it. A corridoras, lifeless on the sand. That moment changes how you look at a tank. It stops being art and becomes responsibility. I reacted fast. Water change, algae removal, feeding adjustment. But then I made a choice that most aquarists warn against. I overfed every day for weeks. I knew it could trigger more algae, more snails, more instability, but losing another cory wasn't an option. And while I was watching the bottom, something was silently taking over the surface. By day 60, floating plants blocked almost all light from above. So I removed them completely, and underneath, no disaster, no collapse. The plants were thriving, the fish were strong, and the mystery baby fish, it survived. Not just that one, but 4 juvenile platies now swam confidently through the tank. What almost failed ended up becoming one of the healthiest ecosystems in my fish room. This tank didn't succeed because everything went right. It survived because I let it struggle and learned when not to interfere. And that's exactly why it deserves a place in my 2025 top fish room stories. Last but not least, we moved to the aquatic insect show. This was the smallest project budget-wise, but attracted by far the largest audience on my YouTube channel. Before we check the 139-day-old Neckar Bowl ecosystem, we need to go back to day 0. Most people walk past places like this every day, without ever realizing what lives just below the surface. A quiet pond, still water, nothing that looks extraordinary. But hidden inside this muddy edge is a complete ecosystem. Predators, grazers, scavengers, all locked in balance. Every scoop of pond soil looks like nothing more than dirt. But each one is a seed. Inside it are animals too small to see, eggs waiting to hatch, and lives already in motion. A small layer of recycled substrate is topped off with play sand, which is a cheap substrate alternative. This is followed by bog bean plants and yellow flag iris plants. Then The pond water is slowly added using a plastic bag to prevent unnecessary disturbances. This bowl isn't built, it's resurrected. Ten days later, and the water stirs, and something moves. A mayfly nymph, an ancient creature whose life is almost entirely spent underwater. It grazes silently, recycling decaying plants, breathing through delicate leaf-like gills, shaping the system without ever drawing attention to itself. This is what most ecosystems are built on: quiet workers doing invisible jobs, which sadly probably also applies to our society. Even here, space is negotiated. A bladder snail swings its shell, and the mayfly retreats. No violence, just boundaries. These snails may look insignificant, but they are essential, cleaning surfaces, recycling nutrients, and quietly prepare the system for what comes next. What some people call pests are often the backbone of stability. Bladder snails, not pest snails in my opinion. But every ecosystem has a hunter, and here it's clearly the dragonfly nymph, perfectly still, almost invisible, until it strikes. Its extendable jaw fires forward, faster than the human eye can follow. In this bowl, it is definitely the apex predator. At normal speed, everything seems normal. But slow the footage down, or speed it up, and the water comes alive. Microorganisms drift, larvae twitch, leaves dissolve into food, a city of movement hidden in plain sight. This bowl doesn't need feeding. A single fallen leaf becomes food, which becomes life, which feeds something else. The most fascinating part isn't that this exists in a glass bowl, it's that it exists everywhere. If you like this collection of my 4 favorite builds and stories of the year 2025, please subscribe to this channel and comment below with your favorite project. If you want to support my work here, please consider joining the Tetra Gang or the Guppy Gang. It's the best way to support my work here directly on YouTube with a monthly paid membership that costs less than a coffee and comes with exclusive perks such as custom emojis, custom badges, early access to new videos, and for the higher tier, even access to members only content. Thank you so much for watching.